Module 3 deals with handle firearms safely. Now, when we talk about safety, we like to talk about what we call a hazard. Now, if ever you handling a firearm, are you presenting a hazard to yourself, to others, or to property? And a hazard, in our opinion, is a potential danger. Now, in order for you not to be a potential hazard to yourself, others, or property, there's 4 golden rules that we need to apply at all times whenever we handle a firearm. The first golden rule is to always identify or establish a safe direction. Now, what is a safe direction? A safe direction is determined by 2 points. And the 2 points are namely, knowing where the bullet's going and where the bullet's going to stop safely. So, should you produce your firearm, or before you produce your firearm, we first need to establish or identify a place where, if this gun discharges, we know we're in full control of knowing where the bullet's going and where it's going to stop safely. Now, at a shooting range, for instance, your sandbank or the bullet trap behind your target would be your safe direction. Because by firing at your target, we know where the bullet's going and where the bullet should stop safely. The problem comes in where we're operational now. Should you be in your home or in the field where we're hunting, before we touch the firearm, we should identify or establish a safe direction. And where would that safe direction be in your home, for instance? Generally, we suggest where a carpeted floor meets the wall, we angle the gun 45 degrees towards the corner. Generally, there's a wooden skirting board that protects the corner of the wall and the floor. We would point the gun towards the corner, and from there we would unload or load the firearm. So in case the gun discharges, the bullet hitting the wall at 45 degrees should stop the bullet, but the wooden skirting board should retain it as well. It's not a foolproof method, but it's a whole lot better than just pointing the firearm straight at the wall or pointing at your window, because should that gun discharge, we definitely don't know where the bullet's going and where it's going to stop safely. In the field, for instance, if you're hunting, find a nice thick trunk tree where by pointing the firearm there, should the gun discharge, the wood should retain the bullet and it shouldn't pass through. But just to point it at your bucky, for instance, or at your car, or just pointing towards the ground, should that gun discharge, are you in control of where the bullet's going and where it's going to stop safely? Be aware that your greatest chance of an accidental discharge is whilst loading or unloading your firearm. So be aware as to where that muzzle is pointing. And people, again, I strongly suggest before you touch a firearm, identify a safe direction so you know where to point the gun. We generally have 2 safe directions. One is where the finger is on the trigger, and one is where the finger is away from the trigger. Now, in terms of having the finger away from the trigger, we would call this handling the firearm. So if we're handling the gun and your finger is away from the trigger, you can either point it up, point it down, or point it away from anybody or anything you do not intend to shoot. But once your finger comes into contact with the trigger, we must now be very aware as to where that muzzle is pointing, so that we know where the bullet's going and where it's going to stop safely. For instance, in a crowded environment, should you use your gun in self-defense, 2 things we never consider. 1, that we miss the assailant, or 2, that we hit the assailant but the bullet penetrates clean through. Where is that bullet going? So even in self-defense, we need to consider, should I miss or should the bullet penetrate through, where's it going and where's it going to stop safely? In a crowded environment, we would suggest that you rather fire from a low-profile position, from a kneeling position, so that the angle of your shot is up. So should the bullet miss or penetrate through, should the bullet pass through, it's going in an upward direction and should limit hitting innocent bystanders in the immediate vicinity. But before you use that firearm, you should have already thought that should you miss or should the bullet penetrate, where's it going and where's it going to stop safely? Again, are you a hazard to yourself, to others, or to property? The second golden rule is to keep the finger away from the trigger until you're ready to fire. The only time your finger should come onto the trigger is once you're ready to fire. So while you're loading or unloading the firearm, the finger must be away from the trigger. This is again what we would call the handling phase. Now whenever we're handling a firearm, the finger must be away. And again, when we fire in, the finger would be on the trigger. But the only time you should put your finger on the trigger is once you're actually ready to fire. There's 3 reasons why the finger is alongside trigger. The first reason is for safety. Without your finger on the trigger, there is no way this gun can fire. Whether your safety is on or your safety is off, your finger alongside will determine how safe that gun is in your hands. We've often seen and heard about people drawing firearms with fingers on the triggers. Now, the minute the front side hooks on the holster and the momentum of the hand moving up, there's pressure on the trigger and the gun will discharge. Again, people there are a hazard to themselves, and generally they shoot themselves in their legs or in their rear ends. Whereas if the finger was alongside trigger, by the gun being hooked on the front sight and the gun being snagged, there's no way the gun can fire as long as the finger's away from the trigger. The second reason why we prefer the finger to be away from the trigger is for direction. At night, if you couldn't see your sights or your gun, the finger gives you direction, and it's as natural as pointing, and everybody can point. By holding the firearm in your hand and just pointing your finger, the gun becomes a natural extension of that finger. So at night, if you can't see, just point your finger and you should have direction onto target. The third reason for finger alongside is to identify your target. Again, we've seen or heard about people walking around their homes with fingers on triggers. They see something in the distance, they get a fright. The natural reaction when your body gets a fright is to tense up. Now, if your finger's on the trigger and the body tenses up, there's a good possibility the gun's going to discharge. Whereas with your finger being away from the trigger, should you get a fright and tense up, there's no way the gun can fire. And to move the finger from alongside trigger onto trigger gives you time to identify your target. Again, are we presenting a hazard to self, others, or property? The third golden rule is to always treat the firearm as if loaded. Now, what this should mean to you is that even though the gun is empty, we should still treat it as if it's loaded. You wouldn't point a loaded gun at your daughter, for instance, so therefore don't point an empty one. By pointing an empty firearm, we believe, again, there's no such thing as a safe gun. The gun is either loaded or it's unloaded, but it's never safe. And we've often heard stories of the devil loading the firearm. It's not a case of the devil loading the firearm, it's just the person forgot to unload the firearm. And with his finger being on the trigger, the gun discharged. So this third golden rule, treat every gun as if loaded, should be an absolute rule at all times. And even though the gun is unloaded, remember, it's still not safe. The fourth golden rule is to demonstrate lawful and safe handling skills at all times. And what we mean by this is, you need to understand that by pointing a firearm, it is an offense. So, even though the gun is unloaded or loaded, just the fact that you pointed a firearm at someone, it is an offense. So, lawful firearm handling skills means that you need to be responsible with your firearm, not just pull it out and point it at anybody. We've discussed again in the legal section in Module 1 that the only time you can produce that firearm is if you believe that your life or someone else's life is in imminent danger, or if you need to effect an arrest. But then be very aware of who you're pointing that firearm at and why you're pointing that firearm at them. And again, we come back to the hazards. Are you again a hazard to yourself, to property, or to others?